So picture this. It's 1857. North India is an absolute powder keg, and it's about to explode in a rebellion that will shake the British Empire right to its very core. What started as a mutiny among soldiers quickly became something so much bigger. And to really get how it all kicked off, we need to go to the gates of the Red Fort in Delhi. Imagine the scene. It's May 11th, 1857. A group of Indian soldiers, or sepoys, show up at the Red Fort. They've ridden all night from a town called Meerut, and they delivered this bombshell of a message to the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah. This wasn't just some grievance. This was the match being struck, ready to set the entire subcontinent on fire. I mean, the speed of this thing was just breathtaking. On May 10th, the mutiny starts in Meerut. The very next day, they're in Delhi getting the emperor's blessing, which gave their cause a huge boost of legitimacy. And in just 2 days, the historic capital of Mughal India was completely out of British control. The news just spread like wildfire, and soon army posts all over were rising up in revolt. So, how did all these mutinies actually happen? You might think it was just total chaos, right? Well, not exactly. It turns out there was a very clear, very consistent pattern to how this rebellion unfolded. And what's really wild is just how consistent this was. It didn't matter if it was Meerut, Lucknow, or Kanpur. The rebellion followed the same script. First, a signal. Then, the soldiers grab all the weapons and the money. After that, they attack government buildings, making sure to burn every single record they can find, especially debt records. And finally, a call for unity goes out, for Hindus and Muslims to join forces. See, this wasn't random. This points to a coordinated plan, with messages flying between different army groups to systematically tear down British power. But you know, this level of anger doesn't just appear out of thin air. Those greased cartridges might have been the spark, but the fuel for this massive fire had been piling up for decades. It came from a really deep well of discontent. Which brings us to the million-dollar question. Why did this one rumor have so much power? Well, it's because it tapped into fears that were already there. The rumor itself wasn't the cause of the rebellion. It was just the final, terrifying piece of evidence that confirmed what so many people already suspected, that the British were out to destroy their faith and their way of life. You have to put yourself in their shoes. Starting in the 1820s, the British had been rolling out all these policies that were changing everything. Now, they called it reform, but to a lot of Indians, it felt like a full-blown assault. They set up Western-style schools, they banned customs like sati, and they even passed laws to let Hindu widows remarry. On top of that, they were just taking over kingdoms left and right, kicking out traditional rulers, and their new tax systems felt totally alien and crushing. Everything people held dear seemed to be under threat. And if you want a perfect snapshot of the British attitude, look no further than this quote from Governor General Dalhousie. Talking about the Kingdom of Awadh, he called it a cherry that will drop into our mouth one day. And sure enough, 5 years later, they annexed it. For the people of Awadh, this wasn't just a political change. It felt like the end of their world. And it created this deep resentment that was just waiting to boil over. And you hear this one word over and over again in the shouts and proclamations of the rebels, Farangi. It's a term for foreigners, but it was often used with real contempt. This tells you something crucial. This wasn't just a fight against a bad law or a high tax. It was a fight against the entire Farangi RAJ, this alien, oppressive system that they believed was destroying their world. Okay, so to take on the Farangi, you need leaders. And what's fascinating is the incredibly diverse group of people who stepped up to guide this massive uprising. I mean, the coalition that came together was just incredible. You had the traditional rulers like the Rani of Jhansi, who were often pushed into the fight by their own people. But right alongside them were local landlords like Shah Mal, who rallied villagers, tribal chiefs like Gunu, and even charismatic preachers like Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah, they called him the Maulvi with the drum, who traveled around calling for a holy war. All right, so we know what the rebels were fighting against, but what were they fighting for? It's a huge question, and thankfully, we have a few documents that survive that give us a really clear picture of the world they were hoping to build. The most important of these is something called the Azamgarh Proclamation. It was issued in August 1857, and you can think of it as the rebellion's manifesto, its mission statement. It lays out this detailed blueprint for a future without the British, and it's really our best window into what the rebel leaders were thinking. So what does it say? Well, it's all about turning back the clock to a world they remembered, a pre-British world, one where Hindus and Muslims lived together,
where traditions were safe, and where every person had their dignity. And this was the complete opposite of what they saw as the British reality, this cold, impersonal, foreign system that treated them like subjects, not people.
And here's where you see the real strategic genius behind the rebellion. The proclamation didn't just make some vague promises, oh no. It spoke directly to the specific problems of every single group. To the landowners or zamindars, it promised lower taxes and their lands back. To merchants, it promised an end to the British trade monopolies. To artisans who were being ruined by cheap English goods, it promised good jobs with native rulers again. It was a really smart, calculated call for a truly united front.
Now, the British saw this as a threat to their very existence, and their response was swift, it was organized, and it was utterly, utterly brutal. Their goal wasn't just to win, it was to send a message that no one would ever forget.
The British basically threw out the rule book to crush this thing. They put all of North India under martial law, which meant that even regular British civilians could sentence suspected rebels to death on the spot. No trials, no mercy, the only punishment was death. This legal terror was backed up by massive military force and a classic divide-and-rule tactic of rewarding landowners who stayed loyal, trying to break that united front.
And if you're wondering just how big this rebellion was, get this. A British official at the time estimated that in Awadh, which was the heart of the rebellion, 75% of the adult male population had joined the fight. 75%. This wasn't a mutiny anymore. This was a full-blown popular war. But the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield with guns and cannons. It was also a war of stories, a war of images. Both sides were desperately trying to control the narrative, to shape how this whole event would be remembered for generations to come.
The British created a very clear story through their art. On one hand, you have these epic paintings like Relief of Lucknow, celebrating British commanders as these heroic saviors. And on the other, you have images like In Memoriam, which showed innocent English women and children huddled together, portrayed as helpless victims of these monstrous, unseen rebels. And this story of innocent victims wasn't just for show. It had a very real, very brutal purpose. It was used to justify extreme violence. You'd see cartoons in the British papers showing a figure of justice, but a vengeful one, literally trampling on Indian soldiers. Public executions, like blowing rebels from the mouths of cannons, were turned into these horrifying spectacles, a performance of terror, all designed to frame brutal vengeance as righteous justice. But as you can imagine, that's not the story that was told on the other side. Later on, Indian nationalists flipped that narrative completely. They took the people the British called villains and turned them into heroes, into the very first freedom fighters. The Rani of Jhansi especially became this incredible symbol, portrayed as a fierce warrior on horseback, fighting for the freedom of her motherland against a foreign empire. In the end, the revolt of 1857 was crushed, and for a very long time, the British version of the story was the only one most people heard. But as we've seen, the rebels had their own vision, their own heroes, and their own powerful story. It all leaves us with this huge question, one that echoes through all of history. When the victors are the ones who write the books, whose voices get lost and what truths get silenced?